Hi, middle schoolers. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 9, Sections 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So please open up TCI to Chapter or Lesson 9, Daily Life in Ancient Egypt. There it is. And then we're going to start with Section 3, which is all about government officials. So take a second to get yourself situated and pull up this section. All right, so we're going to be learning about five different classes, social classes of people who lived in ancient Egypt. So this first section is about government officials. Please read along as I read out loud. Government officials belong to the highest class on Egypt's social pyramid after the pharaoh. Their job was to assist the pharaoh in his or her role as supreme ruler of Egypt. Government officials were often members of the pharaoh's family or other upper class families. Most of them inherited their positions from family members. However, trusted servants from the royal court sometimes rose to power. Important government officials. Three important officials were the vizier, the chief treasurer, and the general of the armies. Each had his own duties. The vizier had more power than anyone except the pharaoh. The vizier advised the pharaoh and carried out his commands. He appointed and supervised many of the other government officials. The vizier also served as a kind of chief judge. Other judges would bring him their toughest cases. A vizier was expected to be fair and neutral, showing no special favor to either side in a dispute. One vizier gave this advice about being impartial or not taking sides. Regard one you know like one you don't know, one near you like one far from you. In works of art, viziers were often shown wearing white, which is the color of neutrality. The chief treasurer oversaw the government's wealth. His main duty was to collect taxes. Egypt's economy was based on goods rather than money. People paid their taxes in grain, cows, cloth, and silver. After the pharaoh, the top military commander in Egypt was the general of the armies. He advised the pharaoh in matters of war and natural security, such as how to protect Egypt's borders from invaders. He also helped the pharaoh make alliances with other kingdoms. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Lives of luxury. High government officials led lives of luxury. Most were nobles who had great wealth, fine homes, and plenty of time to socialize. The lavish banquets enjoyed by these wealthy Egyptians illustrate their grand lifestyle. Hosts took pride in the meal. Cooks might roast duck, goose, pigeon, quail, antelope, sheep, and goat. Dishes were piled high with special delicacies that might include figs, dates, grapes, and coconuts. A variety of breads and cakes and honey completed the feast. Guests at banquets dressed in fine linen clothing. Both men and women wore perfume. Women often wore ropes of beads as jewelry. They painted their nails, lined their eyes with makeup, and used lipstick. At the start of a banquet, it was customary for guests to offer the host lengthy blessings such as wealth, great happiness, a long life, and good health. The host often responded simply with "welcome, welcome," or "bread and beer," as a way of saying, "come and eat." The feast began with men and women taking their seats on opposite sides of the room. Important guests were given chairs with high backs. Everyone else sat on stools or cushions. Servants, mostly women, waited on the guests. There were no forks or spoons, so people ate with their fingers. While the guests ate, musicians, dancers, and acrobats provided entertainment. Musicians were usually women. They played flutes, harps, rattles, and lutes, which was a guitar-like instrument. And guests often clapped along with the music. All right, so we read through section 3. Now you're going to answer number 2, which says, write down 3 or more important facts about the types of government officials and their responsibilities. So take a second to work on that, and then we will talk about it as a class when you're done. So you don't need to move forward until we've talked about it as a class. All right, let's move on to section 4. Section 4 is titled Priests. Like government officials, priests were powerful and highly respected in society. A large network of priests served under the pharaoh, who was considered the highest-ranking priest of all. The duties of priests. Priests had different jobs. The high priest advised the pharaoh and oversaw all religious ceremonies. Temple priests were in charge of the temples scattered throughout Egypt. Other priests handled more common concerns and requests. They gave advice and performed healings. Women were allowed to be priestesses in Egypt. They were generally regarded as equal to male priests. Their main duty was to oversee temples that were devoted to music and dancing. Temple priests played an extremely important role in Egyptian religion. Every temple was home to one or more Egyptian gods. At least they believed that. A temple priest's primary job was to take care of his temple's special god in a variety of ways. A temple's god was thought to live in a statue. The statue was housed in a holy room called the sanctuary. Only a priest who had purified, which means cleansed, himself could enter the sanctuary. There were many steps a priest had to take to be purified. He had to avoid certain foods, such as fish, that were associated with the lower classes. He had to cleanse his body by bathing in holy pools 3 or 4 times a day. He also had to shave off all of his body hair. And he had to wear clothes made of linen cloth, because animal products like leather and wool were considered unclean. Once he was purified, the priest could perform his sacred duties. The priest's role in burial practices. Priests had a special role to play in burial practices. Egyptians believed in a life after death. They thought that in the afterlife, a person's body remained with his or her dead spirit. For this reason, the Egyptians used a method called embalming to preserve bodies from decay. Priests oversaw this sacred ritual. The embalming process had many steps. First, the embalmers removed the body's organs, such as the brain, lungs, and liver. They used hooks to pull the brain out through the nostrils. Only the heart was left in the body. Egyptians believed that the gods used the heart to judge a dead person's soul. Then the organs were packed in jars to preserve them. The organs and body were dried out with a special salt called natron. After about 70 days, the embalmers washed and oiled the body. Then they wrapped it in hundreds of yards of linen cloth. The embalmers decorated the wrapped body, or mummy, with pieces of jewelry and protective charms. Often they placed a mask over the head. Finally, they spread a black, gooey gum over the body and wrapped it a final time. The mummy was then ready for burial. First, it was placed in a wooden box. The box was then stored inside a large stone coffin called a sarcophagus. Because the ancient Egyptians believed that the afterlife was much like life in this world, they buried other items along with the box or coffin. These included food and drink, furniture, statues, jewelry, gold, clothes, games, and mirrors. Not all Egyptians could afford such complicated burials, but even poor Egyptians wrapped their dead in cloth and buried them with loaves of bread and other items they thought would be needed in the afterlife. All right, now let's move on and answer once again question number 2, which is write down 3 or more important facts about the types of priests and their duties. All right, let's move on to the next section. All right, section 5, scribes. In the social pyramid, scribes were one level below priests. Scribes were Egypt's official writers and record keepers. They were highly respected and well paid. Most scribes worked for the government. Others worked for priests or nobles. Only men were allowed to be scribes. They came from all classes of society, though. Becoming a scribe was one of the few ways that men could rise above their parents' social class. Scribe schools. Boys who wanted to become scribes had to attend scribe schools. The schools were run by priests. Most students came from artisan or merchant families. Very few boys came from the peasant class. Schooling started around the age of 5. Students typically spent 12 years or more learning hieroglyphics, the symbols used in the Egyptian system of writing. This writing system was quite complicated. Most students first mastered a simpler form of writing and then worked their way up to hieroglyphs. Students had to memorize over 700 hieroglyphs. They spent as many as 4 years copying the signs over and over. They practiced their writing on pieces of wood, flakes of stone, and even broken bits of pottery. As their skills improved, students were allowed to write on papyrus, a type of paper made from the papyrus plant. Students in scribe schools did not have an easy life. Classes sometimes lasted from dawn until sunset. Teachers were strict and often treated their students harshly. Teachers punished students for being lazy or for not paying attention. Beatings were common. One stern schoolmaster wrote, "A youngster's ear is on his back. He only listens to the man who beats him." The work of the scribes. Ancient Egyptians kept all kinds of records, so scribes held a wide variety of jobs. They recorded amounts of the grain and food supply. They wrote down the results of the government census, which counted the people living in Egypt. Some scribes calculated and collected taxes. Legal scribes recorded court cases and helped enforce laws. Military scribes kept track of the army's soldiers and food supply and the number of enemies killed in battle. Every scribe used the same tools. For pens, a scribe used finely sharpened reeds. For paper, he used a sheet of papyrus laid on a writing tablet. The tablets were made of wood or stone. Each tablet contained 2 wells, one for black ink and one for red ink. A small container held water that was used to wet the ink. A scribe carried his tools with him wherever he traveled. His tablet hung from a cord slung over his shoulder. Attached to the tablet were leather bags and cases that held his other tools. Scribes also carried rolls of papyrus. This paper was a remarkable Egyptian invention. The Egyptians made paper by first cutting the inner part of the papyrus plant into strips. These strips were soaked in water for several days until they were soft. The soft strips were laid out in a crisscross pattern and then pressed between 2 sheets of cloth until all the water was absorbed. Finally, the papyrus strips were pressed one more time to form a sheet of paper. All right, now let's answer number 2. Same question that we're going to answer for all these questions. You don't need to answer all the questions, just number 2 for each section. Number 2 is write down 3 or more important facts about scribe schools and the types of work that scribes did. After you finish that up, and after we talk about it as a class, you can move on to the next section, which is section 6. Section 6 is about artisans. Below the scribes on the social pyramid were the artisans. Egypt's artisans were highly skilled laborers who created some of the most beautiful art objects in the ancient world. Yet, unlike scribes, they rarely got respect from higher classes. Only the few who became masters at their craft were sometimes honored for their work. Types of artisans. Artisans specialized in any one of a number of crafts. Workers in this class included carpenters, jewelers, leatherworkers, metalworkers, painters, potters, sculptors, and weavers. Artisans made many beautiful objects, including stunning jewelry and elegant furniture. Painters portrayed scenes of Egyptian daily life. Most artisans were men, but some women wove fabric, beaded clothing, and made perfume. The most skilled artisans were the stone carvers. They produced the statues, engravings, and reliefs found in Egyptian temples, tombs, and monuments. Stone carvers played an important role in tomb building. The belief in an afterlife inspired wealthy Egyptians to order elaborate tombs for themselves. Stone carvers helped equip the tombs with artworks to honor and preserve the dead. Artwork might include statues of the deceased, highly detailed wall engravings, and stone coffins. Stone carving was demanding and time-consuming. Carvers often worked with hard rocks such as granite. They used dolerite, another type of hard rock, to pound out an initial shape. Finally, they refined the shape and carved in details, using stone tools and copper chisels. Then they used quartz sand to smooth and polish the object. Painters often added color to the finished product. The daily life and work of artisans. Artisans were a class toward the lower middle of society. They lived with their families in modest homes. That means homes that were not that big. Their houses were usually rectangular and barely 10 yards long. That means barely 30 feet long. 3 rooms stretched from front to back. The first room was used as a workroom or to house animals. The living room came next. The final room was divided into a kitchen and a bedroom. The roof was sometimes used as another place to work or sleep. Artisans typically worked side by side in big workshops. They usually worked for 10 days at a stretch before taking time off. The workers depended entirely on their employers for food. In hard times, when food was in short supply, artisans often went hungry. Pharaohs called upon hundreds of artisans at a time to work on royal projects. Artisans created the fine artwork that often covered temples, royal tombs, and other monuments. They worked in large groups to complete engravings, paintings, and hieroglyphics. Despite artisans' skill and creativity, the upper classes often viewed them as little more than common laborers. Even the most talented artists were rarely allowed to sign their work. But some artists did receive recognition. Employers sometimes threw a banquet for their favorite artist. Occasionally, they honored an artist by letting him portray himself in a painting or an engraving. All right, now we're going to move on and complete, you guessed it, question number 2. Write down 3 or more important facts about the types of artisans and their work. All right, let's move on to the final section, section 7. Section 7, Peasants. Peasants made up the lowest and largest class in Egypt's social pyramid. They were generally considered unskilled laborers. Yet Egyptian society depended on their work. Peasants grew the crops that supplied everyone with food. When not busy working the fields, peasants helped build monuments like the pyramids. The 3 seasons of the Nile. Peasant life revolved around the Nile River. Its 3 seasons were the flooding season, the planting season, and the harvest season. The flooding season lasted from June to September. During this time, the Nile overran its banks and fertilized the fields. Farmers had to wait for the waters to go down before they could work the fields. In the meantime, they labored on royal projects such as building pyramids and temples. In October, the planting season began, and farmers sowed their fields with seeds. The biggest crops were wheat and barley, which were used to make bread. Peasants worked in pairs to sow the fields. The farmer softened the earth with a plow pulled by cattle. A second person, often the farmer's wife, followed behind to scatter the seeds. Throughout the season, farmers carefully irrigated the land. The harvest season began in March. Usually the farmer's entire family helped with the harvest. The men cut down the plants with sickles, which are metal blades with short wooden handles. Then the women and children gathered the tall stalks of grain. During harvest time, everyone worked from dawn to dusk. Peasants often sang songs to make the long hours of labor go more quickly. Sometimes musicians played in the fields while the workers sang. All right, let's move down. The daily lives of peasants. Peasants had the fewest comforts of any of the social classes. They lived in plain houses made of mud bricks. Their furniture was sparse, often just woven mats. The peasant's diet was also simple. A typical daily meal might be made up of onions, cucumbers, fish, and homemade bread. Peas and lentils were also common. Unlike the upper classes, peasants rarely ate meat. In times of famine, they often had to boil tough papyrus plants for food. Peasants spent most of their lives working, but they did have some time for fun. Men enjoyed a river game that involved knocking each other off papyrus rafts. Holidays were celebrated before planting and after the crops were harvested. Peasants also took part in festivals held to honor the Egyptian gods. An important time of year for peasants was the end of the harvest season. As a reward for their hard work, they were allowed to gather up any leftover grain and keep it for food. But farmers could also be punished for a poor harvest. They had to pay taxes in the form of crops. If a harvest came up too short to pay the required tax, a farmer might be brutally beaten. All right, now you're going to answer question number 2. Write down 3 or more important facts about the work of peasants during the 3 seasons. Once you do that, we'll talk about it as a class. And thanks again for watching this video. I'll see you again next time.